Hello, welcome to Not the BBC and Happy New Year. So, to kick us off this year, I just held a brilliant interview with Cynthia Chung on Aldous Huxley, the counterculture and scientific dictatorship. So, Cynthia runs the Rising Tide Foundation with Matthew Ehret. She's Matthew's right wife, and she also blogs at, she does some great research and writing at Through a Glass Darkly. And this is a interview where we comment and we cover a four-part series that she wrote on Aldous Huxley, on the various sort of involvements that he had on different parts of counterculture and scientific dictatorship, and some of his sort of interaction with institutions like the Tavistock Institute. I mean, there's just so much fascinating stuff to explore in this series. So, I think you can both watch the series, you can both watch the interview, but also I would suggest it's quite a good compliment to actually reading the series as well, just to hear Cynthia's her commentary on it. So, if you do have time, I would recommend reading the series before listening in. It might help provide some context, but it's a really, really fascinating discussion, and I really enjoyed speaking to Cynthia. This is one of the more interesting pieces of work you're going to find, because it, as I comment at the end, in terms of sort of understanding the nature of the matrix and social control and the reality that is fed to us from, the administrators at the level of empire. Well, this is the best kind of one of the best perspectives you're going to get, and it's a critical frame for understanding the way that the world works. So I really enjoyed it, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to it. Thank you. Hello, Cynthia. Welcome to Not the BBC.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm very excited to have you on. Your husband Matt came on last year as one of my most popular interviews and one of the favorite ones I've done. And we discussed a series that he wrote about the sort of eugenicist and transhumanist roots of the Great Reset, a 3-part series. Now, you've written a similarly brilliant series, 4-part series on, I guess I would sort of call it sort of Huxley and scientific dictatorship, and it kind of really ties together a lot of threads on the sort of particularly on the cultural side of things, and on the sort of like the narrative control side of things. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm very much looking forward to digging into it with you now.
Great.
Yeah, so yeah, like I said, there's lots of different threads there's lots of different kind of things you can take from it. But I'm just kind of curious to start off how you would describe the series and what you kind of meant to communicate in putting it out there.
Well, I actually originally was thinking I was going to be writing one article because I've been fascinated, as many people have, with not just Brave New World, but George Orwell's 1984. And obviously these things nowadays are being talked about even more so possibly than before, because there seems to be a lot of prophesying going on. And my take with Huxley was always that it was not a warning. And so I wanted to approach doing an article on this with backing up basically why I thought that was the case, because it's, I think, not very useful or empowering for people if they hear speeches, like very famous speeches like what Huxley did at Berkeley, thinking that this is like some kind of prophetic, very intelligent warning, because ultimately what he's telling people to do as solutions to avoid this, which in the end is not really something he ever says is really going to be avoided, is that we have to have mass depopulation as one thing. We have to have forms of sterilization, since perhaps, eugenics is too strong of a word. But it's interesting that so many people, when they think of Aldous Huxley, they don't really think of those concepts, even though in Brave New World Revisited, he's quite stark in it. In his lectures, he's quite stark as well with the language he's using. And so there's a lot of confusion. However, as I was already familiar as well that his brother Julian Huxley, played a big role in a lot of the science policies that we see having taken over today. And T.H. Huxley's grandfather played a big role in Darwinism, but I had no idea what I was going to be getting into. I wasn't planning on it being a 4-part series, and there's still so much more actually to the story that Matt and myself have decided that there's definitely a book that can be done on this, which is going to bring in some of the other, roots to transhumanism, which overlaps with Huxley's work with Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit, and so forth. So it's very, and then you have this weird, connection with the prominent psychoanalysts like Carl Jung, and then you have the Aleister Crowley network, and then you have the Tavistock, Krishnamurti. It just gets crazier and crazier. So
yeah, it's an interesting, for someone who's supposedly a sort of prophet, it's a very interesting sort of trail of kind of activities, right? Trail of interest and trail of networks and trail of relationships and trail of research for someone who's just sort of like prophesizing, right? And I guess so your point is that this notion of prophesizing, it's better to view Huxley as someone who's more prescriptive, who's kind of thinking more with more intent about how elites should think about controlling population, about kind of establishing an ultimate revolution.
yeah, well, I would say that the more you look into Aldous Huxley's life, the more I saw a person that ultimately was a failure, and probably knew on some level that they were a failure, and a failure not just in, like, I think, achieving certain things that I think a basic human being would like to achieve, but he was a failure in his family's eyes as well, because there was immense pressure growing up in the Huxley household to uphold the T.H. Huxley legacy. And already, their father was not, a very significant player. He just basically wrote books on the works of T.H. Huxley and Darwin. But the pressure was so great that the middle brother of Julian and Aldous had committed suicide. He hung himself on a tree on the grounds near, they didn't find him for a week, I think. So it was a very brutal time. Aldous lost his sight too when he was relatively young, and so it kind of took a little bit of pressure off of him. And Julian had suffered from nervous breakdowns throughout his life. And when you had the London bombings, he actually was being hospitalized for one of these nervous breakdowns, and they had to transfer all of the patients to another hospital. And he was in hysterics, and they gave him electroshock therapy. So, the Huxleys are quite high level, but at the same time, the more you look into this, the more you realize how brutal they are to their own kids. Like, the Huxleys are more high level than Alan Dulles, but even, Dulles subjected his 2 kids to the MK Ultra program as well. So there's something like really inhumane already with how they grow up. And there's this kind of tragedy. And Aldous was never in control of his destiny. And he wanted very much to amount to something. And that's really the best way to try to understand him, is this kind of desperate struggle to form a legacy, to form an importance, because the world that they were taught to situate themselves in spiritually, because what T.H. Huxley ended up doing with Darwin was basically they had created a sort of modern science, much of like what our science today is based off of. It removed religion, which obviously there's good and there's bad to that, but there's I would say mostly bad. Even though I myself am not a religious person, I am a spiritual person, and I would say philosophical. Like, I very much situate my understanding with Plato, but that there is a creator of the universe, and there is, I believe, a benevolent creation to the universe. There's a purpose too. There's a directionality, and what Aldous and Julian were raised in as an environment was to deny that the universe was random, it was cold, it was impersonal, and that man was nothing but a beast. So there was nothing divine, there's nothing sacred in that identity. So that's already something really hard to deal with when you fully embrace such a view. And H.G. Wells, who was a student of T.H. Huxley, ended up being a mentor to Aldous and Julian. H.G. Wells wrote The Science of Life with Julian Huxley. And Bertrand Russell was also a major, mentor of Aldous Huxley. Even though Aldous didn't really like them as personalities, they were very much in control of the narrative that Aldous ultimately took upon himself. So Aldous never came up with any kind of thought of his own.
Mm. That's a very interesting way to frame it, because one thing that kind of struck me when reading this, because obviously you're looking at it, you're approaching it quite cynically when you sort of realize you start to realize how how much of this has kind of influenced our lives and controlled society and stuff. But yeah, one thing that kind of struck me was that you do get this sense that Aldous is kind of searching for answers in the way that he seems to sort of dive headfirst into the various kind of various pursuits, right? Whether it's getting whether it's actually kind of taking all these psychedelics, or whether it's kind of the kind of relationships he builds in the way you talk about how he becomes best friends with certain figures in Hollywood and stuff like that. The way he sort of floats around kind of speaks to someone who may be a bit conflicted and that certainly hasn't found his place. So it's quite an interesting way, and it's quite an interesting way to think about it. And that also kind of speaks to the way that he is slave to certain other forces, right? Certain forces which are bent on understanding how to control people. But one thing that kind of struck me about what you said was that that Aldous was raised to believe in this quite sort of random negative view of the universe, right? That everything was random. And so just a question on that. So do you glean from that the elites, the people that are pushing this science, do they really all believe it themselves, or is there kind of an element of, because you see the kind of the benefits that certain conceptions of the world bring about, right? The randomness makes people, and a belief in no God makes people more fearful of death, makes them easier to control, and various things like that. So I'm just kind of wondering on your take on that. Are we to glean from this that elites always believe, and it's sort of, and their adoption of certain truths and certain scientific doctrines more speak to something about them, their own problems with the world or something like that? Are we kind of to take it that way, or are we to kind of take it in a different way, whereas they have a certain imperative, which might be to establish scientific, dictatorship?
It's certainly not reasonable. It's not a reasonable explanation, and it's a loaded one. So I'll answer it in several ways. One of them is the Mustafa Mond example. So Aldous definitely is identifying with the Mustafa Mond character, who is one of like about 12 controllers, and then there's a higher up which you never get to meet, right, in Brave New World. And Mustafa Mond says things like, in one part he's marking some scientific paper that has been submitted to him, and he's saying, this is really brilliant, but it's heretical because it's going to challenge the main line, and we can't have that. We can't have an idea of purposefulness or directionality because it has an unpredictability to it. And so there's part of the ideology is that there's a belief that we cannot allow for creativity to form without it being checked, because it could cause a whole bunch of problems in the future, which is a very incredibly cynical view. But any kind of discovery that's going to give more to everybody is considered a really bad, destructive thing. The control should only be kept in a few hands who are responsible and intelligent and yada yada. Like, it's obviously a very self-serving view, but they really do think of the common person as a bit of an insect that will just chew through everything if you allow it. And then the other the other part of this story is that they, like, again, also Mustafa Monge, there's a part in the story where the savage, John Savage, asks, do you not believe that in God, that God exists? And Mustafa Monge's like, no, I think that he most probably does. And so the savage is like, then why do something that is clearly in opposition, it seems, to what something that's higher than you desires? And Mustafa Mon responds that, well, we view God as more of an absence presently. And, the savage says, but that's your fault that he's absent, meaning that you don't have a relationship to this. That's why it appears as an absence to you. And Mustafa Mon's call it the fault of civilization. So again, it's this idea of like just unchecked development, unchecked prosperity, in a sense, is the doom of the golden days of oligarchy, in a sense. And we can't have that because it will bring upon doom for some reason. They believe in this. But the other side of this is mysticism. So what's interesting is that almost all of these people, they have mystical beliefs. And this is where you see Mount Verita, the Ascona story, which is in part 3 of this series, where you have a lot of prominent people all of a sudden gathering in one spot. Mikhail Bakunin, the international anarchist, was involved in like the pre-founding of this. But you had, Otto Gross, who was one disciple of Freud. You had later on Carl Jung come into this. Hermann Hesse, who's considered one of the founding fathers of cybernetics. You have D.H. Lawrence, who's the mentor of Aldous and all of this. And there's part of this is the sun worshipping religion that comes out of Ascona, which they don't make up. It's a twisting of certain, Hinduism beliefs, but also, other things. And the Theosophist Society also shares in this sun worshipping. And I make the point that, with Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey's work, that they talk about the solar angels, and that Lucifer was the most well-known of the fallen solar angels, and that Lucifer is good. And in order for us to have the brightness of these solar angels, we must bring about darkness. So you start to have, like, they have an inability to understand a benevolent, a loving God, but they know they have in their minds something that they can serve, which is more of a frightening kind of God, a God that is willing to make terrible sacrifices, massacres, and everything for an apparent good. Like, all of the definitions kind of are turned upside down onto their heads.
Yeah, that's an interesting kind of common thread is, Mustafa Mon's notion of, God being an absence, and then in the other one about kind of Lucifer being a kind of angel of good, or however it was that you framed it. There's an inversion in kind of both cases, right? That in the Brave New World, the dictators sort of become God is an absence, because they, I guess, increasingly seek to play that role through kind of engineering the human race, through controlling all truth and science and things like that. And it seems there's an inversion in the what's the name of the mountain of Monte Cristo, or
Mount Verita, which is a mountain of truth. Yeah.
There we go. But yeah, there's a kind of inversion there where they kind of flip things on the head as well. You spoke about them kind of being quite positive about Lucifer, but also the way that you talk about them believing that the unrestrained kind of pursuit of pleasure and kind of all unbridled liberation and things like that. And so
Yeah.
and the kind of unbridled pursuit of individual, yeah, like the kind of individual's goals and stuff like that. And so
Yeah.
kind of both cases, there's like a, yeah, it seems that, yeah, that's an interesting common thread. They kind of flip the natural order almost.
Well, that's the thing we should probably explain to people, that Otto Gross, who's the disciple of Freud, before Jung came onto the scene, he was really the one that kind of took over as a type of leader at Ascona. And it's precisely what you're saying, right? That the goal for, because he, as a psychoanalyst, right, he had come to the conclusion that all of this mental sickness, you could say, all of the dysfunctionality that was occurring in society was a result of Western civilization itself. So the traditions, the classical teachings, all of these expectations of, like, what are considered appropriate in Western civilization was the problem, and that had to come under attack. And Otto Gross was really of a very extreme view that any kind of pleasure, any kind of desire, you should act it out, or else you're going to have a whole bunch of psychological problems in the end. He wanted to even set up a school in Ascona, but he ended up becoming quite unstable because he was doing whatever he wanted, and it wasn't working out for him. Part of that was really bad drug addiction that caused him to go in and out of asylums for years, until he basically died after being found cold and passed out on the street. But he wanted to start a school, and it was Max Weber, one of the pre-founding fathers of the Frankfurt School, who wanted to fund him to do that. Later on, it was the Frankfurt School that was discovered, but that was basically the thing, is that Otto Gross was one of the conduits possibly for that. And we can go a little bit more into what the Frankfurt School was in terms of attacking Western civilization. But then on top of all of this weirdness, you have now Theodore Rus, who starts this Masonic temple with the Ordo Templi Orientis. I mean, this is so insane, but it's not, it's like in the public, like nobody denies this. And then Aleister Crowley, yeah.
And sorry, just quickly, and to thread this together for people that are listening, this is kind of relevant in the arc of the series, because Aldous becomes quite involved in this sort of scene and has relationships with these types of characters, right?
Well, yeah, he's it's D.H. Lawrence who's very much a part of this scene, and Otto Gross very much influenced Hermann Hesse, D.H. Lawrence, Carl Jung. He really is like their mentor, and D.H. Lawrence becomes one of the mentors, if not the leading mentor, of Aldous Huxley. And D.H. Lawrence himself takes a lot of the teachings of Otto Gross, but he also develops this kind of Lawrentian metaphysics, which goes into like these concepts of blood and earth and all of this, which, but again, this type of sun worshiping as well. And he wrote very strange books on this, and that very much influenced Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, and Christopher Isherwood, and they were known as the Sonnenkinder, the children of the sun, which again, looking into how this is all tied into the concept of the solar angels and all of this, you can say that there is a link. You could say, children of Lucifer, and they do view Lucifer as a good thing. They do view that it's absolutely important that Lucifer, takes over.
Can we draw threads between these sorts of characters? And I mean, I haven't kind of substantiated all this, but lots of people talk about the Satanism in Hollywood and stuff like that today, and the Freemasonry and things like that. Are we to draw threads between that and some of the kind of satanic references that are quite common in popular culture today?
You mean, are they connected?
Yeah, like
yeah.
Are we to view this as a sort of genesis of that? Of
yes. Yeah. And I wouldn't say that Freemasonry was. See, the thing is that there was, it seemed, before the 1800s, a good form of Freemasonry that went extinct, but pretty much it seems since the 1800s and later, it was extremely corrupted. And, it's the same thing with mysticism. There does seem to be like positive elements to mysticism, but in large part today, mysticism is like very, it's completely used to, it's really complicated. And I guess what I'll tackle the mysticism thing a little bit later, but just to get onto the point of Aleister Crowley coming onto the scene, sure. Aleister Crowley made the law of Thelema, which is do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. So again, and Timothy Leary would like to add with love at the end of it so that it doesn't sound so scary. But the thing is that these are like the first small corruptions, you can say. It sounds, not that bad if you word it in the sense of empowerment and all of this sort of thing. And that's basically what their take is. It's actually very similar to the Gorgias dialogue with Plato, which is that these people really believe that Western civilization has robbed them of their actual strength, and that Western civilization has domesticated people, so that they have lost this kind of primitive power that they used to have.
Which has elements of truth in it, right? Any civilization sort of domesticates people to some degree, but all these things, they kind of have their root in some truth, and they make things kind of even more perverse, don't they?
Right. Well, like, again, with D.H. Lawrence especially, he very much focused on that primitive strength. So it's not even like to have like any kind of thought or reasoning, but it was your primitive desires and everything. That's where, the core of the power was located. And you can see actually a lot of overlap with like what Aldous Huxley is promoting as well with the pre-formations of the counterculture movement, which is that it's not about thinking, it's about opening the mind and allowing the experiences to come forward. And, D.H. Lawrence thought that blood, had like centuries old memory, and, that you had to just allow these things to play on you. But the thing is that as we see today, there is, I agree, a type of control right now in much of a civilization, which is taking away the power of the individual. It's disempowering the individual. But freedom and liberty is never to just be allowed to do whatever you want to do, right? Because some people, that's their other extreme take of this, is that I just want to be able to do whatever I want to do. But there's always a higher law, and if you're not religious, you can say it's a natural law. And so we are free to do what we will, but through always reason, and you have to always have a kind of checking of yourself. You don't create the laws yourself. You are still like, something that is located within a universe that has pre-existing laws. And so to want to violate those laws is the corruption. But we are endowed with, yes, a naturally inherent freedom and liberty, but always in conjunction with that, never like separate individuals.
Yeah, it's almost like if for the individual to affect the world, to have an impact in the world, they need to sort of submit themselves to these universal truths. They need to accept some restraint on their desires and on their wishes and things like that, and only then can they actually influence the world. Whereas if you do not accept that, and you just kind of and you accept the sort of any random individual impulse, then you're sort of doomed to spiral in schizophrenia or complete chaos. And
well, that's a strange thing about these techniques, is like as we you see when you look into it further, is that they use it on the masses, and that's one way of using these techniques, like the Tavistock technique and all that, which we can get into next.
That would be interesting for you to. I'll let you finish your point, and then I'll make.
Well, it's something to keep in mind is that they also use those techniques on themselves, which is really weird. But they think of it in a different way for the elite, but it's also quite brutal. And then, you're always thinking like, well, there must be some higher up above this that's just like pulling the strings. Perhaps, but the more you get to know like what are the higher ups of the higher ups, the more you do realize that there is definitely insanity. And I do think that unfortunately it is, you know, very much like the Poe story of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather of the lunatics have taken over the asylum. It is very much like that. And that's the thing that people have to realize, is that even though this is quite pervasive at this point, and they have empowered the worst of the worst type of people, there is, if you were to become aware of it, and you were to start actually checking that, it is ultimately an inferior and more impotent way of being. You're not as powerful. It's only because they're so obsessed, okay, with like getting, and by the way, they've had a lot of failures. They've had a lot of failures in the 20th century. It hasn't been just like going according to plan. And there's failures right now. It's not looking necessarily like it's going to be working out for them. And especially geopolitically, there's a lot of things that are not working out for them. But the Tavistock MK Ultra thing, like I mentioned, Julian Huxley even went through electroshock therapy. He said it was so painful he passed out. It's a kind of brutal, cold world that they live in, and it's unfortunately, it seems like a mental disease that has been going on for centuries, that they've been passing down to their offspring. You hear like horrible stories from Eton, Oxford, Cambridge. Like they put their own servants. Like Cambridge is of the higher order, Oxford is more for like the foreigners, but they put their own people through certain types of psychological torment for obedience, and it's all about just subjugation. Which actually I forgot to bring up, that H.G. Wells, he wrote in his Open Conspiracy about the modern religion, right? So with the modern science that T.H. Huxley and Darwin put forward, we would also have now a modern religion. And that was part of why Aldous Huxley was so interested in studying things like Christian mysticism or Hindu mysticism and so forth, was to remove the sacredness, the divine part of a god, and having a relationship to something good and moral and having a dialogue with that. And rather, it was now blind subjugation. H.G. Wells says something pretty much along those lines. I have the direct quote in my paper. And that it's not even about thought or believing anymore. It's just to submit.
Questioning, submission. I mean, he sees religion for, you know, there's many aspects for religion of religion, right? And people get different things from it. But obviously there's one obvious aspect which it can be used for, you know, it's used for social control and for getting people to submit to a certain order. And so that is a sort of element of religion that Wells, at least, or that Wells, you know, particularly is interested in, isn't he? It seems.
Well, yeah, that's what's ironic, is that in an age where we believe that atheism is the most prominent that it's ever been, since Christ, we actually have religion.
Yeah.
It's just the religion that's been concocted by, you know, the whole H.G. Wells grouping, and the counterculture was a form of religion. And I don't think we have enough time in this session to go through the whole Krishnamurti theosophist connection, but that was the kind of skipping steps, false like religion or spirituality that was like gutted, emptied out, and they put like, you know, LSD pills into it, and then they like handed it out to everybody. And it was not about understanding anything. It wasn't about doing any work on yourself. It was just to allow your desires to take over, and that was somehow going to bring paradise onto earth.
That was very interesting, that part of things, where it's a discussion with Watts, and he's saying, and with Alan Watts, and
Alan Watts, saying,
and one person, and kind of the other, I can't remember who says it, but one of them saying, so what you're saying is that people don't need to do anything to achieve enlightenment, like you've already achieved it just by being. And that kind of struck a chord with me, because you kind of think about the quite sort of narcissistic kind of I was going to call out the youth today, but I would say the kind of last few generations, like we all kind of suffer from that, where we all kind of think we're special, and we all kind of think we're enough, and we all think we've achieved enlightenment, we've achieved good without having to ever make any sacrifices or toil or anything like that. And
Mhm.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, it was with the Swami from the Vedanta Society of the Southern California branch. And yeah, that was the thing, is that the Vedanta Society did not look well upon Krishnamurti, because they saw that his teachings, as this discussion with him and Alan Watts, which Alan Watts included in his biography. So he was really not ashamed of this conversation. He thought he won the debate. Where the Swami is saying that the teachings of Krishnamurti are destructive, because it's telling people that they can achieve enlightenment with no work at all, no discipline, nothing. Um, and what you're basically releasing are the worst parts of yourself that you let unchecked, the most animalistic parts, which you're going to be your most disempowered in that kind of state. It's allowing people to choose their slavery and to enjoy it, as Aldous Huxley made the point of. But on top of it, what was so creepy was that the Tavistock Institute, and the MK Ultra is really a branch off of this, coordinated much of this from the very get-go. Everything that seemed to be an organic, free love creation was really orchestrated from the very beginning. The human being gathering that supposedly launched the Summer of Love, and all of this was controlled by the Tavistock, and Aldous Huxley was working with those networks. I think really quickly for the session, people should know that Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd were the ones who really kind of spearheaded the human potential movement. And that's what launched the Esalen Institute. The two founders of this, they were completely inspired by the human potential movement. And they're pretty much the official launching of that, which was through Aldous and Gerald Hurd's lectures. And the Esalen Institute, you can now find it still on the Wayback Machine. They were working with R.D. Laing at the very beginning, who was publicly working for the Tavistock Institute, and they wanted to invoke schizophrenic traits into people, and they were actually claiming that this was going to be an IQ increasing experience. And the Frankfurt School is also tied into this, which we don't have enough time to go into, but that there's very clear from the get-go. The Esalen Institute was for the elites, the training for the not elite elites, but you would say alpha pluses, because again, like the betas, the alphas, the gammas, and so forth in Brave New World, none of them are free. All of them are still in a caste system. It's just that the alpha pluses have a certain kind of more, you could say, freedom, so to speak.
Well,
but still,
they need to have a bit more agency if you're kind of thinking about how to kind of administrate society, then you need the people at the top to have some capacity for independent thought and freedom and stuff like that. So they're allowed a little bit more.
But they can't break the rules. Yeah, they're not allowed to change the rules of the game. And so no matter how much power you think you have, you can never affect that. And that's what happened with Helmholtz Watson, right? In the story, is that he gets sent off to an island, we're told. And those kinds of people can't be tolerated. So the Esalen Institute is for those types of alpha pluses, and it's there to corrupt them. It's there to bring out the worst of them, so that you're most easily controlled when people know what your weaknesses are. And neuro-linguistic programming came out of the Esalen Institute, a whole bunch of creepy, Ewan Cameron, B.F. Skinner, Loretta Bender, Dolan West, all were their work was publicly praised by the Esalen Institute's Center for Research, which I also have links to. You can only access it now with the Wayback Machine. To these really horrifying forms of experimentation they were doing, not just on adults, but children. And it was all to figure out forms of control for the people going through the Esalen Institute. And it is definitely mixed in with the whole like ritual occult as well, because the ritual occult, for depending on the layers you're using it in society, it is mostly for control. But then the elite, I do believe they believe that they're the only ones who can wield the magic of the occult. It's very weird.
Yeah, it's that's the Esalen Institute and the way they're kind of training elites and the alpha pluses. It's another interesting kind of frame for people to have, because one thing that's occurred to me recently is that perhaps the best way to control the world or to sort of influence the world at scale is to influence the values of elites, or the values or the truths and the
Mm-hmm.
personalities of elites. And that's kind of how you
Mm-hmm.
can ultimately, in sort of a decentralized operating have a decentralized operating system for basically kind of coordinating things in the way that you want. And so that's kind of helped me whenever you try and it becomes hard to believe that everything is so coordinated. Like, that's kind of one way that I've come to think about it. And so it's interesting when you see things like that, when you hear things about the Esalen Institute and the way they are really working on these very, very elite people, and people who are far more, several stratums above the average person, kind of helps validate that is part of how they go about it.
Yeah, there's a mass, you can say, sort of brainwashing campaign that's going on for several levels in society right now, which is to remove the ability to ask questions, to pose questions in an intelligent manner, and rather it is just inducing for people to know where their limitations are, not push against it, under the illusion that they can still live a modicum of a comfortable life. And we have increasingly a society that's not willing to fight or sacrifice anything for the concept of good, because again, with what T.H. Huxley and Darwin did in promoting such a cold idea of the universe, truth and goodness also don't really play a part in that kind of a world. And I think increasingly a lot of people, they don't really believe in such a thing as truth and goodness anymore. um,
Yeah, this is people. A lot of people speaking about this being a spiritual war and a kind of a spiritual revolution that's needed over and above the kind of because it's easy to get caught up in the economics of things or the geopolitics of things and stuff like that. But when you kind of frame this, you realize how every layer of society, people aren't ready to act in the right way, to make the people aren't instilled with the right values and the right understanding of the world, such that they make the right decisions and the right trade-offs, right? People just kind of,
mhm.
and so until that happens, we're going to stay stuck in this prison, because there's just no cost benefit analysis for any course of action for people that's going to make sense, because everything is really bound by this kind of negative, fearful, individualistic, kind of, utter liberation kind of view of the world.
Yeah, to just love yourself is ultimately a pretty empty sort of love, and it's a very unfilling love. And like Plato makes the point as well in the Gorgias, that someone who just seeks out pleasure, it's like a vessel that's full of holes that you're just constantly trying to keep filled, but it's all coming out always, always. So you're never going to feel that kind of satisfaction. Whereas if you can love something that has a more eternal quality, you will actually be much happier, and you will also be more willing to be a defender of things, and you won't be living as a slave does, but as a free person. Because a free person isn't that you avoid pain or that you avoid discomfort or challenges. A free person is a person who defends the good, and they do it of their free will. But our species can't survive if we don't have that, because obviously, whether we like it or not, we can't put the genie in the bottle. We can't go back to a different time period. We have to grow up as a species and accept higher levels of responsibility.
Yeah, we see this. Yeah, we see this through I don't know if it's people paraphrasing Huxley, but through the notion of that, it's people's pleasure and people's desires rather than their fear that will ultimately prove the best way to control people. I think Huxley might talk about that in Brave New World Revisited. But we've got just a few minutes left, so I'd just kind of like to wrap up and get your comments on like the different threads that I put together and how I think this is useful for people. I really recommend people read all of it because there's a million different directions it can take you in. And I think in terms of understanding the nature of reality within an empire and the nature of kind of controlling people's conceptions of the universe and stuff like that, and for kind of creating a framing for the matrix and the reality that we inhabit, I think it's about the best piece of work you're going to find. And there's just so much to take from it. But in terms of like the takeaways, the first one is starting out with, earlier on I asked you about, do the elites believe in this stuff or do they use it because it's useful, right? It's useful for social control. Do they believe in the chaotic, view of the universe and stuff like that? And you brought up Mustafa Mond, and I think he's an interesting character because he speaks about the role that controlling truth plays in people and making the average person feel purposeless and controlling everything about their kind of understandings of the world. That is a foundational piece for controlling people, right? And so with that in mind, it's really important for people to consider that everything about the world that you're taught kind of plays into a certain conception of the world, which will engineer certain behaviors in you, right? So that's kind of the first one. Do you have any comments on that as a takeaway?
I think, people just have to understand where the roots of what are the predominant ideas, where did they come from? And that's, I think, a starting point to start making sense of this weird upside down, topsy-turvy world that we find ourselves in, and that there are good ideas and philosophies that are there. It's just that we've been conditioned now to not know about them because we've had an educational process for slaves for the greater majority of the 20th century. And so people have to realize that you can get a lot of empowerment and wisdom. You just have to know where to look for it, and you have to basically re-educate yourself because we've been largely indoctrinated.
And specific manifestations of that are things about us being, kind of removing any notion of us being divine creatures and stuff makes us feel kind of powerless and existing in this random universe. It's interesting. It's important for people to kind of internalize how that leads to a sense of passive acceptance and kind of, you speak about the disagreement between Darwin and other scientists about evolution and I learned that kind of rereading your series that there have been scientists who viewed a kind of a role of intentionality in evolution and stuff, which just kind of opening that door to people is greatly empowering for people to realize that actually there are people out there, very, very credentialed and smart people historically who have really viewed a role for us actually imposing the good or imposing a direction on the world, right?
Yeah, and it tells us the nature of the universe, that the universe does yearn to create specific types of things. So, the evolution of the nervous system, the evolution of flight, and so forth, were conscious choices in evolution that you saw happening in multiple places in the world, very close to each other. So it wasn't just this transmigration type idea. And so I think that it's really a comforting thing to think that we are made in conjunction with that goodness, and we don't have to be these terrible types of creatures that we're told we are, which is a parasite on the earth and so forth. But we actually have a lot of potential for the good, and that you could say we're created to do those actions.
Yeah. It's something I'm very keen on digging into, And to rattle through the kind of the last few of my takeaways, well, the second one is when you start looking at the relationship that Huxley had with Tavistock and CIA and stuff. I mean, that's the documentation you need to realize that there are people higher up. This isn't just kind of random chaos. In our email thread setting this interview up, I spoke about, a lot of people kind of view the weakness of the Western man as like, function of strong men create good times create weak men create bad times, etc. And like, I think there is a truth to that cycle, but that can kind of lead people away from really understanding that a lot of this stuff was kind of engineered, and obviously you need certain conditions to manifest themselves so that elites can get leverage for the kind of programs they want to put out there. But I think it helps us realize the extent to which this stuff is engineered, and that's the second one. And with that in mind, it's interesting to look at the counterculture and the role that, again, the CIA played in that. And so all the individualism that's around today, again, and Huxley's notion that it's easier to control people through pleasure, it's another thing to reflect on. And the last one, which I didn't have in mind before when I first read it, but which I kind of learned chatting to you today. We've spoken about, I just mentioned the intentionality, right? That people like the CIA, and if you look in other places, you see a lot of sort of non-profit money, Rockefeller money, Carnegie money going into these sorts of programs. But the notion that these, the elites kind of do also subject themselves to these practices as well. And so the notion that we are sort of in someone else's madhouse.
Yes.
And I think it's Pareto, the Italian political philosophy, talks about how societies are basically, everything's downstream from the values and the practices of elites, and when the elites crumble, society, they kind of take society to ruin with it. And so it's just interesting to consider that there, a lot of the people up top, they really do seem to believe this stuff, and they're kind of putting themselves through these quite perverted and weird practices, and they kind of submitting themselves to these weird beliefs for whatever reason. And so there is an element of utter chaos to the situation that we're in as well.
And they assume that their viewpoint, nobody can see anything, or reality doesn't exist out of their own viewpoint as well. So if they struggle with all of these corruptions, all of these things that are like eating away at them, they assume that no individual is free of that. No individual could possibly be better than them because they're the elite.
Yeah, they project that onto us, and we are sort of coerced and consigned to our fate of accepting the sort of negative view of the world and their perversions and the kind of limitations of their worldview.
But I think, a lot of people, they are starting to question in several different ways, as we were bringing up at the beginning of this call. There are a lot of people, and I think that's why, Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Foundation, they started to, I don't know how that's going now because they've since divorced, but they wanted to start doing an educational process on epistemology. So it used to be that epistemology was not a very interesting or sexy thing. Okay, I'll be off soon. But they started to tackle that, which just goes to show that a lot of people now are going to the absolute source in where they're questioning their reality, and people should continue to do that, and it will bear fruit.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand you need to dash off now. That was a lot to squeeze into an hour. We'll have to have a follow-up because I think there's just so much important stuff in this series. But like I mentioned earlier, I really recommend people go ahead and read it. And I guess, thank you very much for coming on. And final words, if you want to kind of point people in any particular direction, maybe Rising Tide Foundation.
Sure. They can find much of my work on my Substack page, Through a Glass Darkly. You can write that with Cynthia Chung. You should be able to find it, no problem.
There we go. I'll put all that in the description. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was super fun talking.
It was
Until
awesome.
next time.
Yeah, cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to that. If you enjoyed the way that I think about these issues, then you might enjoy Pith Weekly. So Pith Weekly is my blog, which I email out every Saturday morning, somewhere where I share my latest thinking on metapolitics, and I also share some highlights of what I've read. I'm always digging through some really critical texts in the area, and it's something which is the center point for what I'm doing. The reality is we don't really know what's going to happen and what platforms people are going to be kicked off of over the next few months, whether YouTube, Twitter, whether Gab's going to take off, but that will always be there. My email will always be there. I will always be sending my best thoughts out and my best learnings out every Saturday morning. So I really hope some of you subscribe. You can find the link in the description. And it'd be great to have you as part of my community, as a node in my network. So thanks again.